All right, we end this. This is the last of this series of lessons on biblical backgrounds. We're going to study customs. We'll talk about here in just a minute. Next week we'll have a guest speaker. I won't be here. I know y'all are celebrating, but well, somebody said, "Well, finally a good speaker." But I'll be in next Wednesday night. I'll be worshiping with a congregation, Lord willing, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And if not, I'll be worshiping with you. If we can't find them, I'll be worshiping with you over the telephone. But anyway, so be looking forward to that. We will start then in 2 weeks. We will start a study of the book of Judges. And so I think it's July the 5th. So if you'd like to go on and kind of get started reading that would be good. But anyway, let me say before I get started, I appreciate your kindness. I know for a lot of folks, history becomes a very dry subject. And that's why, in many ways, I was hesitant to do this series. But the truth is that history and historical background really, I wouldn't say complement, I think it completes the story of the Bible. It helps us understand, because let's face it, we think of life in terms of today, what is going on today, and we have to really see the Bible through today's eyes, but we also, and more importantly, have to see it through the eyes of the people of that day and what was going on with them, and then it makes sense to us. And so, as I've said before, not during this series, but as I've said before, I still remember a couple of my teachers in undergrad talking about putting on first century glasses to help us understand the Bible. And I think by studying biblical backgrounds, we do that. And you've been so kind and complimentary in this series. And I hope that it's just, not that it's given you anything new, but it's just kind of refreshed your memory of all these things. And we've kind of combined and compiled all these things together. But tonight I want to look at customs. You know, every culture, every group has customs. And you stop and think about it. Families have customs. This congregation has customs. Your family, I'm sure, has customs. Our society has customs. And it's all right that we have customs. There's nothing wrong with customs. But when customs become the law, if you will, then we do have a problem. But these things I want to talk about tonight are things that were practiced. And when you talk about religious customs, there were customs that unfortunately the rabbis made pretty much law through the years. And we'll see those in just a minute. But as we think about customs, we think about these acts that folks did and they practiced. And it helps us as we look at these things, it helps us to understand what was going on in these stories and understand a little bit of what God intends for us to understand. Religious customs is what I want to start with. Religious acts are colored by traditions. Whether, you think about it. Religious acts for us are colored by traditions. From number of songs that you sing, to the way you sing them, to the songs that we do sing, to the way we pass out the Lord's Supper, to the time which we start services, to the way in which we conduct our services, the order that we conduct our services. It was suggested in the congregational meeting, and we have a sermon on the Lord's Supper, and I think that is wonderfully true and well fitting, and I'm sure the elders will agree with me, because I think we've done it once before since I've been here. But we will probably put the Lord's Supper after the sermon that Sunday, probably the first or second Sunday of August. The elders and I will talk about all that and make sure. I've already put them on the spot, and I hate to do that to them, but I don't think I'll have any problems getting those two things fixed for us. And but the tradition of where it fits in the Lord's in the worship service, the tradition of where we put the contribution in the worship service. We don't pass out plates now, and that's fine. There's not a problem there. But when you get to pass out plates, you always put the Lord's Supper and then right after it, the contribution. And one of the congregations that I worked for in years past, we got to where, because some of the folks the elders had noticed, they said, we want to do something different. So I said, well, why don't we have a song in between the fruit of the vine and the contribution? And so we started doing that, and we met position right at first, but the elders helped educate folks, and they saw that, okay, it's not the Lord's Supper. And so we were able to do that and pull that off. And so there are traditions like that. Well, what were some in the Bible? Look in Exodus chapter 20, if you don't mind. In Exodus chapter 20, we find the Ten Commandments. And in the Ten Commandments, you go down to verse 8, and you find this commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then it's interesting, because when you think about the Ten Commandments, we just think of one right after the other. And that's usually how it's listed. When you go find it on a board or on a poster or something somewhere, it's just one right after the other. But think about what is said here. And Moses received on Mount Sinai. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. When you think about the explanation, especially in verses 9, 10, in verse 11, one of the things that you find out is that the Sabbath was, first of all, it was to be kept because it was historical. God had created the world in 6 days, and the seventh day he rested. And since God had done that, we should do it as well. It's really what you might say is practical. It's practical in that it gives a day of rest. And then it's also prophetical in that it's looking forward to our coming day of rest that the Hebrew writer talks about in Hebrews chapter 4 when he talks about heaven. But in biblical times, the Sabbath day for the rabbis, they'd really pretty much ruined it. Remember, as we've been talking about for the last 2-3 weeks, that the Talmud, which is for the Jews, the Old Testament, and remember, that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's not the prophets. That's not the books of poetry of the prophets. That's something else. They don't consider them their authoritative law. But then you had within the Talmud, you had the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is the writing down of the oral law. And the oral law and the Gerar itself were interpretations of the law. And through the years, those weren't written down. Matter of fact, it was not really until the intertestamental period that they wrote the oral laws down, the Mishnah down. They just passed them down from generation to generation. And as usual, if you've ever in, say, your workplace, the workplace will pass a law or pass a rule, rather, and then instead of maybe changing that rule or taking that rule away, they just add another one, and then they add another one, they add another one, they add another one, and they just keep adding rules instead of taking some away. Well, that's pretty much what the rabbis did. And as your outline says, that the rabbis over the course of time developed a whole system of traditions to the point it had gotten absurd. But according to the Mishnah, the oral law, and according to the Gerar, the commentary or the interpretation of the law, the rabbis said that here's the other things you can't do on the Sabbath. The Lord said you can't work, But then they said, well, you can't plow, you can't sow, you can't reap, you can't bake, you can't put out a fire, you can't tie a knot, you can't even spit. Now, this one was interesting as I got to study it. You can't spit because the dry land at that time, here's the way the rabbis interpreted it. The dry land at that time, if you spit, that spittle may create a furrow in the dust. And by it creating a furrow in the dust, it has worked, and you have worked. That was their interpretation. And so you couldn't even spit, and you couldn't look in a mirror. And the reason being, as time went on, the reason being you couldn't look in a mirror was because you might see, according to the way they said it, you might see a gray hair and pluck the hair, and that would be work. And so you couldn't even look in a mirror. It had gotten through the years that absurd. And yet, according to the law, it was simple. Keep the Sabbath day. Well, why? How does that fit in then into the New Testament? Well, let's look. Luke chapter 6. In verse 1 following. It says, now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. Now think about this. Jesus and certain of his followers are going through the fields. It is the Sabbath day. No work. It's kind of interesting what they're interpreting here, because you're not even supposed to travel on the Sabbath. But yet Jesus is. He's walking through the fields, and they're hungry, so they find some grain, some ears of corn, and they rub them, if you will, rub the cobs, rub the corn in order to get the grain off. And so when they did, notice what happens in verse 2. Some of the Pharisees said to them, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? Jesus answering them said, have you not even read this, what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some of those with him, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. He uses the illustration of David and David doing something that from a standpoint of right really wasn't. But in using David, he's saying, look here, life is more important than what little laws you're trying to scratch out of the old law. And then by verse 5, he is trying to show them, but we have what is better. And he's talking about, when he refers to the Son of Man, who's he referring to? Himself, right? He's referring to himself. And so he says the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the master of the Sabbath. In other words, you need to listen to what I'm telling you, because I'm the Son of Man. I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. But it had gotten to the point where the Jews said, well, you can't even feed yourself on the Sabbath. And it had gotten that bad and to that point. John 5, verse 2 is another one following. Verse 1 beginning, it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, which, by the way, that's the same place we get our Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. And what was believed, if you go on reading verse 4, that an angel came down and disturbed the water, and the first person that got into that water at Bethesda would be cured or healed of whatever malady they had. And so there's a certain man, verse 5, that was there who had an infirmity for 38 years. Jesus saw him laying there, knew that he'd already had been in that condition a long time. He said, do you want to be made well? And the sick man answered him, sir, I have no man to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me. And Jesus said to him, rise, take up your bed and walk. And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, walked, and that day was the Sabbath. Well, guess what? Yeah, and it worked, and the Pharisees didn't like it. And of course, then that's what brings up all this. Notice that it says, the Jews therefore said to him, who was cured, it is the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to carry your bed. And Jesus answered, or excuse me, he answered and said, who made me well said to me, take up your bed and walk. In other words, he said, I'm going to listen to him. He made me well. I've had this malady for 38 years. Now, he told me to walk. I'm going to walk. And so they asked him, who's the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? And Jesus, verse 14, afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you've been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. And the whole story, I'm going to ask you to go on and read the whole chapter, if you will, when you get home or tomorrow or sometime. But there was a conversation. In other words, this man, been made well, they didn't see the good. All they could see was the violation of the Sabbath. They had so strained at a gnat to swallow a camel, as Jesus said of them. They had so strained at a gnat to swallow a camel that they couldn't see the good that was going on because all they could see was the breaking of the Sabbath. Well, that was a religious custom that had problems. Ritual washing, we'll not spend a lot of time with this. Basically, it's just this. The Pharisees were very afraid, well, Jews really too, but Pharisees were very afraid of being contaminated by the Gentiles. Now, we've talked about the Gentiles. We've talked about them last Wednesday night. We talked about them Sunday morning, and I spent a lot of time, who we're talking about. But they felt like any contact of any kind with a Gentile would make them unclean. And so consequently, they would have ceremonial washings. Now, I'm not talking about, when it says there, it talks about washing of cups, pots, and vessels. I'm not talking about, as we would think of, getting them down in a pan of water and washing them, or getting them in the sink and washing them. I'm talking about a ceremony where you would have water in a particular vessel, and you would bring it and you would pour it over your vessels in a ritual in order to cleanse them, and you would not use them till the next day, not because you didn't need them, but because they might be unclean. And this might be even if they hadn't even seen a Gentile. Well, you see part of the problem, and I'm going to ask you to read Mark 7 on your own to get some of that here, if you don't mind. There was also the claiming of Korban. This is one that from a religious standpoint, that's to me always been sad. We know that the old law gave the families the power, but I guess the instruction that as the older ones got older, you were to take care of them. So you were to take care of mom and dad. You were to take care of grandma. But you were to take care of mom and dad, and you were to give them a certain portion of what you made. By New Testament times, there were those that began to, as they would take things in, they would simply claim this as Korban. This is Korban. And it was really their way of saying, you're not going to touch it. Because I've said this is Korban, this is mine, and it's for me. Now, ultimately, they would say, well, no, they would say, I'm really saving this for God. But really, ultimately, they were saving it for themselves because they would use it on themselves. Look at with me in Mark chapter 7. We're going to pick up at verse 10. Mark chapter 7, verse 10. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is Korban. That is, it's a gift to God. You can't touch it. Now, my mother and father have already passed away. But I just couldn't see, didn't do it. The fact that when something became mine, that if I was supposed to help my family, that I would just say, Corban, this is a gift of God, and I don't have to give it to you. But that's what they were doing. Jesus said in verse 12, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such things you do. When he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but those things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. So he says, look, this is a heart issue. This is a heart problem. And you have closed off your heart by your traditions. You've closed them off to what God's even told you to do. And so he's trying to correct this tradition that had gone wrong, sort of like the Sabbath and the ritual washing. Then there was fasting. We don't fast. The Bible does talk about fasting. In the old law, the only time you had to fast, as we talked about last week, was the Day of Atonement. That was the only feast in which the Jewish folks had to fast. Fasting is good, but let's think about it from several different vantage points. Let's think about it from, first of all, a standpoint of what is good today. Fasting is not good for everybody today. Diabetic needs to eat 3 meals a day, 3 square meals a day. They can't go without fasting. Some of the medicines that folks take, you have to eat. You have to either eat before it or after it, or you can't eat. Suzanne takes a medicine. She gets up and takes it because she can't eat for like an hour till an hour later after she's taken the medicine. But then you have to eat. And so fasting is not always good for everyone, but fasting is good. Jesus fasted. If you think about it, Matthew chapter 4. Fasting in biblical times was used for several things. It was used oftentimes, especially in the Old Testament, for mourning. When you were grieving, you would fast. Times of crisis, you would fast. It's Jonah fasted in Jonah chapter 3, verse 5. He was penitent of things that he had done, the fact that he'd tried to run away from God, and so he fasted. Certain religious events, Exodus 34, of course, significant religious events, fasted. The early church talked about fasting. I've given you some examples there. Acts 13, 2 and 3, 14, 23, 2 Corinthians 6, verse 5, 11, 27. Fasting is not a bad thing. I don't fast. You can look at me and tell I don't fast. Fasting, if done correctly, and for really what God intended on, is a good thing. You take that time where you're supposed to be eating and you spend it with God. You develop yourself spiritually. The younger adults, the 20-year-olds, one of the things that a lot of them are studying now, it's interesting, is what you might call spiritual development. And it's the idea of a lot of things. It's solitude, Bible study, fasting, prayer, things that cause your soul to grow. Good things. Now, and they study people that are not members of the church, like Foster and others. And I have some of the books. And it's good stuff. But in some of those books where it talks about fasting, it makes some very good points. You got time to think. You got time to meditate. You take that time where you should be eating and you think and meditate, and it cleans out your system. And there's a lot of good to it. But we don't do it. Why? Well, we're not commanded to do it. We're not told how to do it. We're not told when to do it. And so we don't have to fast. Now, if you so choose, I'd be glad to talk to you about it, but you don't have to. Well, There were times of fasting, and that fasting, though, had changed. By the time you get to the New Testament, fasting had become sort of a way of self-proclamation. Look in Matthew chapter 6. We're going to read 2 or 3 verses here, but suffice it to say, in Matthew chapter 6, one of the things that Jesus is talking about, and he uses 3 things. He uses, first of all, the giving of your means to the Lord, charitable means. Secondly, he talks about prayer, and then he talks about fasting. And as he's talking about these 3 things, he's trying to make, or he's not trying, he's making one point. And that is that you do these things with sincerity, that you don't do them so as to bring upon yourself a glory that wherein you're glorified and not God. And so what happened with regards to fasting is that people might be fasting, they might not be fasting, but they'd put on makeup that would make them look as if they were pale and look as if they were gaunt, and they hadn't eaten in a long time. They put powder in their hair to really make them look like, they were almost to the point of starvation and sick because they've been fasting to be proclaimed, in order to be proclaimed by everybody else, as religious. And Jesus rebukes such. Notice what he says, Matthew chapter 6, verse 16, Sermon on the Mount. Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites. Hypocrites are folks that play a role, remember, with a sad countenance. For they disfigure their faces that they may appear to be men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, in other words, okay, if you're going to fast, here's what you do. What do? Well, you anoint your head, wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. You do your fasting in order to improve your relationship with God, not so people will pat you on the back and say, boy, aren't you religious? And so Jesus kind of set straight, if you will, a religious custom that had gone haywire. Well, there are other religious customs. I did find interesting, and have found it interesting through the years to study on fasting, that most of the times the rabbis had gotten it to down to Mondays and Thursdays. You fasted on Mondays and Thursdays. Why? I don't know. They just picked those days and said, these are the days, if you're going to fast, these are the days we're going to fast. And there's a mention of it in Luke chapter 18. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. Fasting is not, it can be done to an extreme, but just from a standpoint of medically, if you can, fasting is good for you. And like I say, I don't do it. I'm not trying to tout it as, oh, I do it, you should do it too. Yeah. I slow. It's not fasting. You're slow. I got it. Yeah. No, I don't practice fasting. That's not, that's a foreign language. Bring on the cookies and the chocolate cake and pie and all that stuff. Well, let's talk about some social customs. We're not going to have time to talk about all of them. Um, well, let's mention the Jews, especially during the intertestamental period. A lot of this rose up. A lot of paganism. Now it's true throughout Old Testament times there was idol worship, because you remember you had Assyria and you had Babylon coming and taking over Palestine. And when you did, they brought in their gods, little g, their idols. They brought in a lot of paganism. But by the time you get to the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, the Jews had become very sensitized to the idea of we don't want paganism. We don't want to be associated with paganism. We don't want paganism to mix in with what we're believing and what we hold true. And so consequently, they really cut ranks with everybody else. You were a Jew or you were a Gentile, as we've talked about before. And so they avoided any and all interaction that they possibly could with them. And they even went as far as to say, and we studied this Sunday, and so I'm not gonna hold you to it, but go look in Acts chapter 10, verse 28, just as a reminder. This is what we studied Sunday morning. They cut all ranks with the Gentiles, and they said, this is not right. You can't be with the Gentiles. And of course, Peter in Acts 10, as we studied Sunday, he was trying to explain to them, yeah, you can. That the gospel is a universal gospel for all and not just for some. But that was one of the social customs of the day. We don't mix with Gentiles. The eating of meats, I'm going to let you do your own study on that. But one of the things that had happened was, and especially trying to stay away from paganism, was the eating of meats that were used in pagan ceremonies was forbidden. And yet in 1 Corinthians 10, if you go back and study it, and I'll encourage you to do such, that Paul says that there are certain times in which that eating of meat would be all right. But the conclusion is don't injure your brother with the eating of meat. If it's going to cause him to stumble, don't eat it. But, you can. And so, but the problem of the eating of meats had become such, and if you go back and read 1 Corinthians 10, you'll see what we're talking about. The custom had become such, this is forbidden, period. And Paul shows how that it's not completely forbidden. Well, there was an animosity, thirdly, there was an animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans, and the Jews considered the Samaritans as aliens, Matthew 10:5, and would not deal with them. The Samaritans had similar hostilities towards the Jews, but that helps us with the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. When you think about, if you will, being in the audience and knowing the hostilities between the Jews and the Samaritans, and listening to Jesus tell the story, and he gets to the point where everybody's listening to this story and they realize that, he's talking about a Jew that's fallen among thieves, and a priest and a Levite, godly men, didn't stop. And then he says, and then a Samaritan. And you're sitting there as a Jew and you're thinking, no, what's he going to do? He'll probably kill him. And yet he stops and helps him. But when you understand the hostilities that they felt, the story that Jesus tells all of a sudden becomes open, because now you see Jesus once again, he's trying to teach these folks gospel for all. And we're all brothers. Sort of like in the Old Testament and the prophets, which Malachi asked the question, he says, have we not all the same Father? Has not one God created us? And then he asked the question, why do we deal treacherously every man with his brother? Well, it's kind of interesting they hadn't caught on to all that. But Jesus is trying to teach that with the story of the Good Samaritan. Well, when you see that hostility and you're trying to put yourself in that audience listening to that story, you're thinking, man, what is going to happen? And then you hear that the most unlikely of heroes in that story becomes the hero. It opens it up. Here's one, the men and women in public. Now, we often throw bad barbs at the men of the Bible. It is true that women were not held in as high esteem as men. That's sad, but it's true. But women were very important, and women were out in public. We sometimes get the sense that women were put in the houses and the homes, and they were shut up in the houses and homes, and they didn't get out. Go back and read Proverbs 31. Doesn't it talk about the woman being in the gate? Doesn't it talk about the woman letting the reputation of her husband be known through the community? She's active. the early church was as indebted to women as the present day church is indebted to women. Women are a strong influence and force in the church. Now, we do not have male leadership in the church, and God set that up based upon creation and orderliness. And and I think that's correct. If you go back and you read the passages that I've listed for you, well, I don't think I put that in there. I was going to, but I didn't. But the passages that deal with in 2 Timothy deal with women and leadership in church and male leadership in the church. But women were important, and they're important today. But women, while they were out in public, they couldn't be overly friendly with the men. Now, you ladies speak to me and y'all talk to me, and thank you. I appreciate that. We live in a different time too. But if a lady spoke to a man very much, if she was considered to be overly friendly with some other male out in the community, it could be considered grounds for divorce. And you might say, oh, surely not. Matthew 19, folks, is there. It's real. You can debate it. We can talk about it. We can talk about Matthew 5, 31 and 32. We can sit here. We can debate it, what we feel, what we think. In many ways, Matthew 19 was put in for the protection of women. You had two different philosophies. You had the Hillel and Shammai philosophies that, especially the Hillel philosophy was that if I woke up this morning and my wife burnt my toast, I could divorce her. And in a society that didn't have any social programs to help them, that's a bad thing. And so while, yes, it's the sanctity of marriage and it's the sanctity of the family, it was also put there, if you really stop and think about it, to protect women. And so it had become something that was a custom that had gone really haywire. Marriage, there's a lot about marriage there, and we're just not going to have the time. Kind of glance through all that. Think about it. When a girl became of age, and that was at 12 years, one day, she could get married. And most did. Boys, when they were 13 years of age, they were considered to be of age, and they could get married. And most boys, by the time they were either 18 or 20, were married. Of course, you didn't live as long as we do now, but nevertheless. And what you did when you got married was you were, first of all, betrothed. This comes into play in helping us understand Matthew chapter 1. A betrothal, first of all, would be like our engagement. When a couple decided to get married, and by New Testament times especially, it appears as if arranged marriages were not part of it. People decided, couples got together on their own. But lo and behold, in order to be betrothed, you would go before two witnesses, and these are our intentions. And your engagement period was no longer than 10 months. And if you were a widow, your engagement period was no longer than 3 months. And you went and you used that time to prepare. But nevertheless, you go through, and I think I pretty well gave you everything to think about there, that during that time frame of being betrothed, it was considered a marriage. And the only way you could end that betrothal was really a divorce. Then, as you move on, couples, of course, got married. Well, how did the marriage take place? Well, usually on a Wednesday afternoon, kind of strange. I don't know why, just the way they did it. But usually on a Wednesday afternoon, they'd get married. And what would happen is that the groom with his friends would go to the bride's home. The father would give her away. There'd be a benediction, which we think of as a closing prayer. but there'd be a prayer. There would be then a reading of the marriage, what we would consider the marriage vows, marriage contract, and the marriage itself was then sealed. Interestingly enough, though, the bride then would kind of go to her home, and the groom would go to his home, and they'd pretty well beautify her, if you will, and they would carry her a little later on in the afternoon. They would carry some of her friends, the virgins, according to Psalm, would carry her to her new home, and she would sit there and wait. And then while she was waiting, the friends that had taken her would stand out and watch, and they would wait for the bridegroom to come. And somewhere in the night, the groom and usually some of his friends, but the groom especially, would come, and from afar off he would be announced as coming. And these ladies that had brought their friend, the bride, to the house would go out and meet him and escort him into the house and into the festival, into the party. Now, do you understand the story of the 5 wise and 5 virgins, why it was so important? That was the custom. That was the wedding custom of that day. And so, of course, the parable itself is talking about, or the story itself is talking about the idea of being prepared and being prepared for the Lord. Then the marriage feast itself would last about 7 days, according to Psalm 78:63, and it was a great feast. Well, there's a mention there, I've got it on your outline, of death. That's an interesting thought. Let me encourage you to just study that, because I don't want to run over time. But to look at that and to look at the verses, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to talk to you about them. But it was interesting. It is interesting when you think about funerals today. Think about the fact that in a funeral procession, it's changing a little bit in the last few years, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But a funeral procession up until a few years ago used to be, you'd have a police car, then you'd have a preacher's car, then you'd have the hearse, and then you'd have the family, and then right behind the family you'd have any friends that were going out to the cemetery. And it's changed a little bit. A lot of it's due to traffic and cars and such like. But in biblical times, you had the women, usually the family, but the women especially of the family, to lead the casket out. You know why? There in your outline. Read your outline, you'll find out. It's interesting. It's an interesting part of history. But nevertheless, there were customs with regards to death, customs with regards to how you buried someone. And some of that has changed, but some of it is still kind of, you say, I kind of see that in what we do today. And so, anything else? Some neat customs. There's a lot more customs, but those I thought were some neat ones to pull out and kind of tie in with the Bible. Well, I thank you. I hope that it's been a blessing. I hope that it will enlighten your study. It will give you some food for thought next time, and you'll say, oh, yeah, okay, I remember that, and I see that, and now I get it. Helps me out a little bit. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our most kind and gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, for all the blessings of it. We thank you for the opportunity that we've had to study your word, to learn really of the social and religious customs of that day. Help us to see in a greater light what teachings you are trying to get us to understand and for us to follow. Help us to be better Bible students. Help us to be individuals that are striving to know what you want us to know, and to live the way you want us to live, so that we can be the lights to our community, the lights in the world, that as you would have us to be. We ask that you be with those that Jay announced earlier this evening. Bless them and keep them. Be with those that are out, that are gone, various places, are also ill, and we don't know about their illness. We ask that you watch over us, bless us, and keep us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.